The smile was the last thing anyone expected. Not tears. Not the specific controlled devastation of a woman managing her wound in public. Not the lifted chin of someone performing dignity for an audience. A smile. Small. Contained. The kind that arrived and departed so quickly that the three people standing closest to her were not entirely certain they had seen it at all. Then she turned and walked out of the Ashworth winter reception through the east entrance, down the stone corridor, through the servants' passage that she knew because she had organized the household for 2 years, past Gerald who held the door with the expression of a man who understood what was happening and was not going to pretend otherwise, and into the cold December night. She did not take her coat. Not because she forgot it. Because the coat was embroidered with the Ashworth crest and she was not taking anything that belonged to that name. She had £3 and her mother's earrings and the specific composure of a woman who made a decision while she was still smiling and was now enacting it without performance. Behind her, in the warmth of the Ashworth winter reception, her husband was still talking to Lord Cavendish and 3 other men about the parliamentary situation, which was what he had been talking about when Lord Cavendish had asked who the woman in the silver dress was, and Edward Ashworth, without pausing, without turning, without the smallest acknowledgement that the woman in the silver dress was his wife of 2 years who had spent 6 weeks arranging this reception and had been standing 4 feet behind him for the past 20 minutes, had said. Nobody important. A household arrangement. 4 words. Delivered in the specific easy tone of a man describing furniture. She had been standing 4 feet behind him. She had heard every word. She had smiled. And then she had left. Stay with me. Because this is not the story of a woman who was broken by 4 words. This is the story of a woman who had been holding everything together for 2 years while being described as nobody, and what happened to the everything when she stopped holding it. Welcome to Regent Hearts. Subscribe before we go any further. Hit the bell. This one is going to stay with you. Her name was Nora Calloway. She had come to the Ashworth marriage at 21 with 2 things that mattered and several that did not. The things that mattered were a mind that processed information faster than most rooms required and a capacity for organizational precision that her governess had described as frankly alarming in a person of that age. The things that did not matter were a family name that had run out of money 3 years before it ran out of appearances and a modest dowry that was not the reason Edward Ashworth had married her. He had married her because his previous secretary had retired and his estate manager had resigned and his household was producing 3 times the problems it should have been producing, and someone at the Pemberton dinner had pointed at Nora Calloway in the corner methodically reorganizing the seating cards that had been incorrectly placed and said, "That girl fixed Lord Pemberton's entire harvest accounting in 1 afternoon. She did it without being asked, and she has been correcting your table arrangement for the past 20 minutes without anyone noticing." Edward had looked. He had seen a young woman in a pale dress doing something useful with complete focused calm. He had made inquiries. He had proposed within the month. She had accepted because the alternative was returning to a family that could no longer afford to maintain her, and because Edward Ashworth was not cruel, and because she had looked at the estate and seen, with the specific clarity she brought to all problems, exactly what needed fixing and had thought, "I can do this." She had not been wrong. In 2 years she had reorganized the Ashworth household accounts with a precision that saved the estate significant money across the spring and autumn quarters. She had resolved 3 tenant disputes that had been running since before Edward's father died. She had managed the seasonal staff rotations, the correspondence, the social calendar, the specific delicate architecture of maintaining the Ashworth position in county society during a period when the estate finances were being quietly reconstructed. She had done all of this without announcement. Not from modesty. From the specific practical understanding that work done quietly was work that got done. That announcing work in progress invited interference. That the most effective position in any room was the one where you were indispensable before anyone had noticed you becoming indispensable. She had made herself indispensable. She had made herself invisible doing it. She had told herself these were not contradictory. She had been wrong about that. The marriage was not what she had told herself it would be. She had told herself it would be a working arrangement. practical, respectful. Two people managing an estate together with the specific efficiency of people who understood what they were there for. It was that. And it was also, in the mornings when they sat across from each other at the breakfast table and he read the correspondence she had already sorted and occasionally looked up at her over the top of a letter with the expression of a man who has just encountered something unexpected in a place he expected nothing unexpected, something else. Something that she had not accounted for when she accepted. Something that arrived slowly and without announcement and that she had been managing for 18 months with the same precision she applied to everything else because managing it was the only available option. She had not said anything. He had not said anything. They had sat across from each other at breakfast for 2 years and managed the estate and been present in the same rooms, and she had watched him, occasionally, look at her with the expression she could not categorize, and she had filed it under, insufficient evidence, requires more data. She had been collecting data for 18 months. The data in November was, he sat in her office for an hour discussing the winter party arrangements, and when she looked up from the correspondence she was sorting he was looking at her with the expression she could not categorize, and then he looked back at his papers and said nothing. The data in October was, at the Pemberton dinner he had walked her to the carriage himself rather than sending the footman and had held the door and said her name in a tone that she had been analyzing for 4 weeks without resolution. The data in September was, she had been unwell for 3 days and he had appeared in her room on the second day, uninvited, with the specific expression of a man who has been waiting outside a door and finally decided to come in, and had stayed for 2 hours not because she required assistance but because he had not left. The data was building toward a conclusion she had not allowed herself to draw because drawing it required hope, and hope in her situation required foundation, and foundation required something from him that he had not provided. She had been waiting for the foundation. She had been waiting through September and October and November and the 6 weeks of winter party preparation during which she had organized every detail of the reception that was now underway in the Ashworth East Wing. She had been standing 4 feet behind him at his own winter reception that she had organized. And Lord Cavendish had asked who the woman in the silver dress was. And Edward Ashworth had said, nobody important. The data collection was complete. The conclusion was drawn. The smile arrived. And then she left. Gerald held the door. He was 63 years old and had managed the Ashworth household entrance for 31 years and had watched the previous Duchess arrive and depart and had watched the current one arrive 2 years ago and had formed his own conclusions about the current situation over the course of those 2 years and was not surprised by what he was watching. He said nothing. She walked past him into the December cold. The night was clear and sharp. Frost on the gravel. Stars the specific brightness of winter sky. Her breath visible in the cold air. No coat. Silver dress entirely insufficient for December in the north. She walked to the gate lodge. Thomas, the gate man, was 61 and had been employed by the Ashworth estate for 22 years. He had a fire in the lodge. He opened the door before she knocked. She sat by his fire for 20 minutes while he sent his grandson to the village for a hired carriage that would take her to the coaching inn. She did not speak. Thomas did not speak either. They sat by the fire in the specific comfortable silence of two people who understood the situation and were not going to insult it with words. The carriage came. She thanked Thomas. She left. In the house, behind her, the winter reception was continuing. She knew this because she had organized it, and she knew the schedule, and the schedule said it would run for another 2 hours. She knew the catering was correct because she had confirmed it Tuesday. She knew the flower arrangements were correct because she had corrected them herself that morning. She knew the music would play through 11 because she had hired the quartet and had specified the program herself. Everything she had built was running precisely as built. Without her in it. She sat in the hired carriage heading toward the coaching inn and thought about that with the specific focused calm she brought to all significant thoughts. Everything she had built was running precisely as built. Which meant the question was not whether it would survive her absence. The question was when he would notice she was gone. She had a hypothesis. She gave it 2 days. The first sign was the breakfast. Not a dramatic sign. Edward came down at 7:30 as he always did, and the breakfast room was, not wrong, exactly. Present. Set correctly. Tea in the correct pot. Bread in the correct position. But the correspondence was not sorted. This was a small thing. It was always sorted. He had become so accustomed to sitting down to sorted correspondence, most urgent on the left, estate matters in the center, social correspondence on the right, that he did not know for a full 3 minutes why the table felt different. Then he looked at the single pile and understood. He looked for Nora. She was not at the table. He asked Gerald where she was. Gerald's expression was the expression of a man who has been employed in a household for 31 years and has seen enough to know when something significant is happening and has formed a view about whose fault it is. Gerald said, "Her Grace's chambers are empty, Your Grace. Her things are gone." The word "gone" arrived in the breakfast room with the specific weight of something that should not be surprising but is. He said, "Gone." Gerald said, "Yes, Your Grace. Since last night." He said, "Where?" Gerald said, carefully, "I could not say." He spent the rest of that morning finding out that he could not find out. She had taken a hired carriage to the coaching inn. The coaching inn had records of passengers heading south. The records did not specify which stop. She had been careful. He spent the morning being unable to locate his wife and trying to continue his morning routine and discovering, with the specific gathering clarity of someone who is learning something they did not know, that his morning routine did not function the way he had believed it functioned. The letters were not sorted. The steward came at 10 for the weekly account review and the ledgers were not prepared. They had always been prepared. Edward had never prepared them. He had simply sat down to a prepared meeting and participated in it. He did not know where the preparation came from. He understood now where it came from. The steward said, "Should I reschedule, Your Grace?" He said, "Yes." At 11 the tenant from the Millbrook farm arrived for the conversation about the boundary question that had been ongoing. He had the documentation for this meeting. He believed he had the documentation. He went to the study to find it and found that the filing system in the study was, present. Organized. But organized in a system he did not know. Labels he had not made. Categories he had not created. A system he had been accessing the products of for 2 years without understanding its architecture. He spent 40 minutes trying to find the Millbrook boundary documentation. He did not find it. He sent the tenant away. At noon the cook came to ask about the menu for Friday. He said, "What about Friday?" The cook said, "Lord and Lady Pemberton are coming for dinner, Your Grace. Her Grace confirmed it last week. I need the final menu approval." He said, "Her Grace confirmed it." The cook said, "Yes, Your Grace. As she always does. Shall I come back when she is available?" He said, "Yes." The cook left. He sat in the study surrounded by the filing system he did not understand. The second sign was the social correspondence. 3 letters arrived that afternoon that required responses by the following week. He could see they required responses. He could not determine from the letters alone what responses were required, what prior commitments existed, what the standing positions on these invitations were, what responses were consistent with the social positioning Nora had been managing. He knew the responses were being managed. He had not known who was managing them or how. He knew now. The third sign was the winter accounts. His solicitor sent a message on the afternoon of the second day asking about the quarterly review that had been scheduled for Thursday. He had agreed to this review. He had no memory of scheduling it. He went to find the correspondence confirming it and found it in the study filing system in a place he identified after 20 minutes of searching under a label he had not made. He found, in the folder labeled Solicitor, Quarterly, every piece of documentation relevant to the review, organized in the sequence required, with a handwritten summary on the front in Nora's precise handwriting that reduced the entire folder to the 12 most relevant points. She had prepared everything. She had prepared everything before she left. Before she left. He sat with the folder in his hands. He thought about the timeline. She had organized this folder on Tuesday. The reception had been Wednesday. She had organized the quarterly review documentation before the reception, which meant before Lord Cavendish, which meant before nobody important. She had been preparing the work that would continue after she left before she knew she was leaving. Or rather, she had been managing the possibility of leaving alongside the continuation of her work because she was that kind of person, the kind that prepared for outcomes she hoped would not occur, because the estate required continuity regardless of her personal situation. He sat with this understanding for a long time. Then he picked up the folder. He went to find Gerald. Gerald was in the entrance hall making a quiet inspection of the winter flowers that Nora had ordered for the reception and that were beginning to fade. Edward came to stand beside him. He said, "Gerald." Gerald said, "Your Grace." He said, "How long have you known this would happen?" Gerald considered this question with the specific care of a man who has been asked something honest and intends to answer honestly. He said, "I have known for approximately 8 months that Her Grace was managing something." He said, "Managing what?" Gerald said, "The specific management required when a person of considerable capability has understood that their capability is valued and their person is not." The words landed in the entrance hall. He said, "She heard." Gerald said, "Yes, Your Grace." He said, "Last night." Gerald said, "I held the door." She did not take her coat. She did not take anything with the Ashworth crest. He said, "She left without her coat in December." Gerald said, "Yes, Your Grace." He said nothing for a moment. Then, the correspondence. The accounts. The filing system. Gerald said, "Her Grace reorganized the estate management over 14 months. The current system produces approximately a third less administrative error than the previous one. I have a record of the changes if you would like to review them." He said, "She gave you a record?" Gerald said, "She left a complete handover document on the desk in her office. Dated yesterday. Time stamped 8 in the morning. The morning of the reception." She had written the handover document on the morning of the reception. He said, "What does it cover?" Gerald said, "Everything, Your Grace. The account system. The staff rotations. The outstanding tenant matters. The social calendar through spring. The solicitor correspondence. The vendor relationships. The household filing system with a key to the organizational logic." He said, "She wrote a complete handover document." Gerald said, 47 pages. 47 pages. Written on the morning she attended her own husband's winter reception and was introduced to his colleague as nobody important. He sat down. Not in a chair. On the bottom step of the Ashworth entrance hall staircase, which was not where Duke sat, but which was where he was when his legs decided they had carried enough. Gerald waited. He said, "Do you know where she went?" Gerald said, "I do not know specifically. I know directionally. South. I know she has means, her own, not the estate's." He said, "She saved her own money." Gerald said, "Her Grace managed the household allowances with considerable precision. The savings she accumulated were from her own personal allocation. She is financially independent for a meaningful period." He said, "She planned this." Gerald said, "I believe she planned for the contingency. I do not believe she planned the specific occasion." He said, "There is a difference." Gerald said, "Yes, Your Grace. A significant one." He looked at the fading winter flowers. He said, "Nobody important." Gerald said nothing. He said, "I said that." Gerald said, "Yes, Your Grace." He said, "To Cavendish." Gerald said, "And she was 4 feet behind you." He said, "I know." Gerald said, "She had been standing there for 20 minutes." He said, "I know." Gerald said, "She had organized every detail of the reception she was standing in." He said, "I know, Gerald." Gerald said, "I am making certain you know, Your Grace." He looked at the butler. Gerald's expression was the expression of 31 years of Ashworth service, the expression of a man who has watched a household run well under someone's care and is not going to let the person responsible for the running be allowed to become invisible without objection. He said, "Find out where she went." Gerald said, "I have already begun." She had gone to Harriet. Harriet Voss was 32 years old and had been Nora's closest friend since they were 14 and had the specific quality of someone who had watched Nora for 20 years and understood exactly what she was capable of and exactly what she needed and never confused the two. She had opened the door at 7 in the morning on the day after the reception to find Nora on the step in the silver dress with a traveling bag and the specific expression of someone who had been composing themselves for a 6-hour journey and had arrived having composed themselves entirely. She had said nothing. She had opened the door wider. Nora had walked in. She had been at Harriet's house for 2 days when the letter arrived. Not from Edward. From Gerald, who had found Harriet's address through channels he did not specify and had written in the precise formal handwriting of a butler who has decided to act outside his instructions because his instructions were insufficient to the situation. The letter said, "His Grace understands the nature of what occurred. He has reviewed the handover document. He has spent 2 days managing without the management. I believe he would benefit from an honest conversation and I believe you would benefit from being the one who determines whether that conversation occurs, which requires you to know that he is looking for you and that I told him the direction but not the destination." Nora read the letter twice. She handed it to Harriet. Harriet read it. Harriet said, "Well." Nora said, "Yes." Harriet said, "What do you want to do?" Nora sat in the chair by the fire in Harriet's sitting room and thought about this with the specific honest precision she brought to all important questions. She thought about 47 pages. She had written them without drama and without announcement on the morning of the reception because the estate required continuity and she was not going to leave it without continuity regardless of what happened that evening. That was not nobility. That was simply who she was. She thought about 2 years. The accounts and the tenants and the social calendar and the filing system and the correspondence and the morning breakfasts and the meetings she had prepared and the problems she had solved before they became problems and the 147 specific decisions she had made every week that kept the Ashworth estate running exactly as it should. She thought about September when he had come to her room and stayed for 2 hours. She thought about October when he had walked her to the carriage himself. She thought about November when he had sat in her office for an hour and looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for 18 months. She thought about what Gerald's letter had said. He has spent 2 days managing without the management. She thought about what that meant. Not the logistics. She knew what the logistics meant. She had prepared the handover document precisely because the logistics were manageable without her if you had the document. What it meant was that he had noticed. Not in the way she needed him to notice. Not yet. But the noticing had begun and the noticing was the beginning of understanding and the understanding was the beginning of, something she could not name because she had not allowed herself to name it. She thought about nobody important. She thought about the smile. She said to Harriet, "I am not going back as a household arrangement." Harriet said, "I know." She said, "If he comes here, he comes knowing that." Harriet said, "Yes." She said, "And if he cannot say that with the specific words, not the managed version, not the implication, then we have a different conversation about what comes next." Harriet said, "And what do you want the first conversation to produce?" She looked at the fire. She said, "I want him to say what nobody important was actually holding together." Harriet said, "In words." She said, "In specific words." Out loud. To me. Not to Gerald. Harriet said, "Fair." She said, "And then I want to hear what he has to say about September and October and November." Harriet looked at her. Harriet said, "You already know what he has to say about those months." She said, "I need him to say it." There is a difference. Harriet said, "Yes. There is." She picked up Gerald's letter. She wrote a reply in 3 sentences. The reply said, "I am here. He may come if he understands that I am not returning as a household arrangement. He should bring the thing he has been not saying since September." She gave it to Harriet's footman for the post. Then she went back to the fire. She did not pace. She did not perform the waiting. She simply sat in Harriet's sitting room with a book she was not reading and waited for the understanding she had been waiting for 2 years to arrive in the form it required. In words. He arrived the following morning. Not in the Ashworth carriage. In a hired one, which she noted when she heard it from Harriet's sitting room window. Not the ducal arrival. The personal one. The one that said, "I am here as myself, not as the title." She had noted this. She did not go down. She waited in the sitting room. She heard Harriet's door. She heard Harriet's voice, which carried the specific tone of a woman who has decided not to make this easier than it needs to be. She heard a long pause. She heard footsteps. Harriet knocked and opened the door. She said, "There is a man downstairs who says he has been not saying something since September and has driven through the night to say it." Nora set down her book. She said, "Send him up." She stood. She straightened her dress. She stood in the center of Harriet's sitting room and waited. He came through the door. He looked as she had expected. Not undone, he was not a man who came undone in visible ways, but with the specific quality of someone who has been alone with a significant understanding for 3 days and has arrived at the place it was always leading to. Dark circles. The coat he had been wearing for a day's travel. The expression she had been cataloging for 18 months. Present and specific and directed entirely at her. She looked back at him. She said nothing. She waited. He said, "Nobody important." She said, "Yes." He said, "I said it without thinking. Not because I believed it. Because Cavendish asked and I was in the middle of a sentence about something else and I answered automatically with the category I had been using publicly for 2 years because I had not found the words for the other category and was not certain you wanted me to use them." She said, "What other category?" He said, "The one that is accurate." She said, "Tell me the accurate category." He looked at her. He said, "The woman who reorganized the estate accounts and saved us from a difficult spring without telling me she was doing it. The woman who resolved the Millbrook boundary dispute that my father started and my steward gave up on. The woman who writes 47-page handover documents on the morning of her own winter reception in case she needs to leave. The woman who sat in her office in November while I found reasons to stay for an hour that I pretended were about the correspondence and were not about the correspondence at all." She said, "What were they about?" He said, "You. They were about you. They have been about you since October when I walked you to the carriage and said your name and thought about what I had not yet said for 3 months and decided to wait until I was certain of the words." She said, "You waited 3 months." He said, "I was constructing the words." She said, "And then Cavendish asked who I was." His jaw moved. He said, "And I gave him the placeholder I had been using while I constructed the correct words and I did not know you were standing behind me and I will spend a significant time being specific about how wrong that was if you will let me." She said, "Start now." He said, "I called you a household arrangement." To Cavendish. At the reception you had organized. While you were 4 feet behind me. After 2 years during which you had built everything that the estate runs on while I sat at prepared meetings and sorted correspondence and attended organized social engagements without once asking who was doing the building. While I was developing feelings I did not know how to say and was waiting for certainty while you were doing the work of 3 people and receiving nothing in return except the title of the arrangement you were. The room was quiet. She said, "You had feelings since September." He said, "Earlier than September. September was when I stopped being able to manage them internally and they started requiring external management." She said, "Your form of external management was sitting in my office for an hour without stated purpose." He said, "Yes. It was inadequate." She said, considerably. He said, yes. She said, nobody important. He said, the most inaccurate description I have ever applied to anything. You are the structural architecture of everything I have that functions. You are the person who knew the estate needed a complete filing system and built one. You are the person who prepared the meeting I would not have known how to run. You are the person who saved the quarterly accounts and managed the spring allocations and wrote a handover document on the morning everything fell apart so that the estate would not suffer for your decision to leave. She said, the estate is not the point. He said, I know. I am building toward the point. She waited. He said, the point is that the woman I called nobody important is the woman I have been trying to find the words for since October and failing to find them and sitting in her office for fraudulent reasons and walking her to carriages instead of saying the things the carriage walking was supposed to say. The point is that I love you. Not the arrangement. Not the capability, though the capability is extraordinary. You. The specific person who smiled and walked out without her coat and prepared 47 pages and did not take anything with my crest on it because she had too much self-respect to take what she had not been given properly. She looked at him. She said, you called me nobody important to Lord Cavendish. He said, yes. She said, in front of 3 other men. He said, yes. She said, at the reception I organized. He said, yes. She said, and none of those men will forget it. He said, no. I will have to correct it. Directly and publicly and with the specific clarity that leaves no room for a different interpretation. She said, yes. You will. He said, I know. She said, and the filing system. He said, I would like to understand it. I have been in the study for 3 days and I have the map but not the logic. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not the smile from the reception. A different one. The one that was not managed. The one that arrived when something was specifically right. She said, the logic is emotional. He said, explain. She said, the filing system is organized by urgency combined with consequence. Not just time sensitivity. What happens if it is not handled versus what happens if it is delayed. The matrix produces a different priority order than conventional systems. He said, you built an emotional logic into an administrative filing system. She said, I built a consequence logic. The emotional part is incidental. He said, I would like to learn it. She said, yes. You would. He said, Nora. She said, yes. He said, will you come home? She said, not as a household arrangement. He said, no. As my wife. Specifically. In every word of what that means. She said, the correspondence will still need sorting. He said, I will sort the correspondence. She said, you do not know the system. He said, you will teach me the system. She said, it will take time. He said, I have been sitting in prepared meetings for 2 years without knowing they were prepared. I believe I have demonstrated that I can learn systems when someone is willing to explain them. She said, I am particular about how the estate accounts are organized. He said, I know. I have seen the result of your particular organization. I am in favor of the particular organization. She said, and the tenant matters. He said, I would like to be involved in the tenant matters rather than receiving the resolution after the fact. She said, you were not interested in the tenant matters. He said, I was not asked to be interested. I was given solutions. I would like to be consulted during the problem. She looked at him. He said, I am not asking you to stop being capable. I am asking to be present for the capability rather than the outcome of it. She said, that is a significant change from 2 years of breakfast table correspondence sorting. He said, yes. It is a change I am requesting specifically. She looked at the fire. She said, Harriet will want to form an opinion of you before I go anywhere. He said, I expected that. She said, she has had 2 days to develop the opinion. It will not be comfortable. He said, I have been in the study for 3 days understanding things I should have understood 2 years ago. I believe I can manage Harriet's opinion. She said, she will ask you what took so long. He said, 3 days in a study with a 47-page document and a filing system I did not know the logic of produced more understanding than 2 years of managed arrangements. She said, that is honest. He said, I am trying honesty. The managed version got me Cavendish asking who the woman in the silver dress was. She said, it will take more than one conversation. He said, I know. She said, the nobody important will take time to correct. In rooms. In front of people. He said, I will correct it in every room I have access to for as long as is required. She looked at him. She said, sit down. He sat. She sat across from him. She said, tell me what the estate looks like after 3 days without the management. Every specific detail. He told her. He did not manage the telling. He did not construct a better version. He described exactly what 3 days of nobody important's absence had produced in the specific household she had been running, with the detail and the honesty of a man who had just learned the weight of what he had been carrying without knowing he was carrying it. She listened. Harriet brought tea at some point. She looked at Edward over the teacup with the expression of a woman conducting an assessment. Then she took the tray away without comment, which was Harriet's version of provisional approval. Outside, Harriet's sitting room windows showed December light going toward afternoon. Cold and clear. The kind of light that made everything specific. Nora set down her cup. She said, the organizational logic of the filing system starts with a simple matrix. Consequence versus urgency. I will draw it for you. She pulled a piece of paper from the writing table. He moved his chair closer. She began to draw. He watched with the complete focused attention she had been waiting 2 years for him to direct at something other than the estate papers. She drew the matrix. She explained the logic. He asked 3 questions that told her he was actually understanding rather than performing understanding. She answered them. They sat in Harriet's sitting room in the December afternoon light and she taught him the system she had built and he learned it with the specific engaged attention of a man who had decided that understanding was more important than appearing to already understand. At some point she realized they had moved from the chairs to the floor, spreading the papers between them, the way she had always worked, and he had followed her to the floor without noticing he was doing it. She noticed. She said nothing. She kept drawing. He kept learning. Outside, December pressed its cold against the windows. Inside, in Harriet's sitting room, nobody important showed the most important person in her life why the system worked. And he understood. Finally. In the specific words and the specific attention and the specific presence she had been waiting for. In the correct category. Final scene. They returned to Ashworth Hall on a Friday. Not to a reception. Not to a corrected version of the winter party or a public announcement or anything that required performance. To the estate. To the study. To the correspondence on the breakfast table that he sorted himself that morning, slowly, using the system she had built, with the matrix drawn on a piece of paper from Harriet's sitting room beside him. He sorted it incorrectly twice. She corrected him twice. He did not resent the correction. She did not soften it. By the 3rd week he was sorting it correctly with only 1 query per morning. By the 5th week he was sorting it correctly without queries. She did not comment on this. He did not make a performance of it. It simply became the new version of the breakfast table. The Pemberton dinner in January was the first public occasion. Lord Cavendish was present. He had expected this. She had not told him to manage it a specific way. She had said, correct it in every room you have access to. She had left the form to him. He waited until the 3rd course. Then, in the specific natural pause in the conversation that he had been waiting for, he said into the table, Cavendish. At the winter reception last month. You asked who the woman in the silver dress was. Cavendish said, I remember, yes. He said, I gave you an inaccurate answer. She is my wife. She is the person who restructured the Ashworth estate management over 14 months and produced better results than the previous system had delivered in a decade. She organized the reception you were attending, managed the account review you asked about in November, and wrote the most comprehensively useful document I have ever read on the morning of the evening you met her. Nobody important was an inaccuracy. I wanted to correct it. The table was quiet. Nora was sitting at the correct position beside him. She did not look at Cavendish. She looked at Edward. He looked back. Lady Pemberton, from the head of the table, said, How long did it take you to write that? He said, 3 days in a study and a 6-hour drive to Harriet Voss's house in Devonshire. Lady Pemberton said, Good. That seems proportionate. Nora said nothing. But the smile at the corner of her mouth was the different one. Not the smile from the reception. The one that arrived when something was specifically right. He saw it. He had been learning to see it. He was getting better at that.